Sometimes the greatest mistake a person can make is believing they already know someone's story before hearing a single word. The quiet suburban street outside Daniel Brooks' home had always followed the same comforting rhythm every weekday morning. Sprinklers whispered across emerald lawns. American flags moved gently beneath a warm Georgia breeze. Parents loaded backpacks into SUVs while neighbors waved from tidy front porches before heading toward another ordinary workday. Nothing about the peaceful neighborhood suggested that within the next few minutes, dozens of lives would remember this morning forever. Daniel Brooks stepped through the front door of his brick colonial house, carrying a simple black travel backpack and a stainless steel coffee tumbler. At 42 years old, the black homeowner carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who never needed attention to feel important. His navy windbreaker, pressed khaki pants, polished brown shoes, and neatly trimmed beard made him look more like an experienced business professional than someone preparing to become the center of an unexpected confrontation. Before locking the front door, he glanced back through the hallway window and smiled softly toward the family photographs hanging inside. They reminded him why every difficult assignment was worth accepting. He adjusted the strap on his backpack and started walking toward the dark blue SUV parked along the curb. Across the street, Mrs. Evelyn Carter watered her flower beds while exchanging cheerful greetings with another neighbor walking his golden retriever. The neighborhood felt wonderfully ordinary, exactly the way Daniel preferred it. His profession required enough unpredictability that he treasured peaceful mornings like this one. Halfway down the driveway, the sound of tires slowing interrupted the silence. A marked police cruiser rolled to a stop beside the sidewalk. The driver's door opened immediately, and Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped onto the pavement with purposeful confidence. A white police officer in his late 30s, Mitchell carried himself with the certainty of someone accustomed to making quick decisions. His uniform was spotless, his posture rigid, and his expression revealed complete conviction that whatever had drawn his attention deserved immediate action. Daniel paused naturally, offering a polite nod that many Americans exchange with local officers every day. Instead of returning the greeting, Mitchell studied him carefully from head to toe before speaking in a measured but unmistakably suspicious tone. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." Daniel complied without hesitation. He slowly lowered his coffee tumbler onto the hood of his SUV and kept both hands comfortably visible. His voice remained calm. "Good morning, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" Mitchell stepped closer, scanning Daniel's clothing, backpack, and vehicle before looking directly into his eyes. "Can I see some identification?" Daniel reached carefully into his jacket pocket exactly as instructed, removing his wallet with slow, deliberate movements before presenting his driver's license. Mitchell examined it briefly, then looked back toward the house behind Daniel, as if comparing the address with the man standing before him. "You live here?" he asked. Daniel answered with the same steady professionalism. "Yes, sir. That's my home." The officer's expression failed to soften. He glanced around the property once more before asking another question. "How long have you lived here?" Daniel offered a small, respectful smile. "Long enough to know every neighbor on this block." Across the street, conversations had quietly stopped. Curious eyes drifted toward the interaction. No one heard every word, but everyone sensed the growing tension carried by long pauses and careful voices. Mitchell handed back the license without changing his posture. "I'd like you to place your backpack on the ground." Daniel calmly complied. "Certainly." The backpack rested beside his polished shoes while the officer continued observing him with increasing skepticism. "Mind telling me where you're headed this morning?" Daniel answered honestly. "Work." "What kind of work?" There was nothing unusual about the question itself, yet something beneath the officer's tone suggested he had already formed a conclusion before hearing the answer. Daniel noticed it immediately, but refused to mirror the tension. Experience had taught him that composure often revealed more than arguments ever could. "Federal service," he replied simply. Mitchell folded his arms slightly, almost amused by the response. "Federal service," he repeated, allowing the words to linger. "That's a pretty broad answer." Daniel maintained relaxed eye contact. "It usually needs to be." The officer looked once more toward the quiet house, then back toward Daniel with growing certainty. The morning breeze continued moving through the trees while birds sang overhead, completely unaware that the peaceful street had begun inching toward a moment that none of its witnesses could possibly imagine. Officer Ryan Mitchell studied Daniel Brooks for several long seconds without speaking, as though silence itself might expose something that questions could not. Around them, the neighborhood continued pretending to follow its ordinary routine, but curiosity had already begun replacing routine. Curtains shifted behind living room windows. A jogger slowed to a walk before quietly stopping across the street. Mrs. Evelyn Carter lowered her watering hose without realizing the water continued flowing onto the flower bed beside her driveway. Daniel remained exactly where he stood, his posture relaxed and his expression composed. He had encountered skepticism before in different places throughout his career, and experience had taught him that frustration rarely improved understanding. Mitchell glanced once more at the driver's license in his hand before looking toward the dark blue sport utility vehicle parked in the driveway. "Is that your vehicle?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Daniel answered. "It is registered in my name." The officer took a slow step toward the vehicle, studying the license plate before speaking again. "Would you mind explaining why someone in federal service needs to leave this early carrying a backpack?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Because my workday starts early, just like yours." Mitchell showed no sign of appreciating the comparison. Instead, he circled back toward Daniel with an increasingly skeptical expression. "Federal service is a broad description." "Which agency?" Daniel paused for only a moment. "I am not able to discuss my assignment while standing on a public sidewalk." The answer was polite, calm, and entirely truthful, but it seemed only to reinforce the officer's suspicions. Mitchell folded his notebook closed. "So you expect me to believe you work for the federal government, but you cannot tell me where?" Daniel nodded slightly. "I understand how that sounds. I also understand that some information is not mine to share." Across the street, another neighbor quietly stepped onto his front porch after noticing several people watching the encounter. No voices were raised. No one interrupted. Yet the atmosphere had shifted noticeably, as though the entire block sensed that something important was unfolding beneath the surface. Mitchell reached for his shoulder radio and quietly spoke with dispatch before listening to a brief reply through his earpiece. His expression became even more confident. "Dispatch cannot immediately verify what you told me," he said. Daniel answered with the same steady tone. "That does not surprise me." "Why not?" "Because not every federal assignment appears on an ordinary records inquiry." The officer interpreted the response differently than Daniel intended. To him, it sounded like another excuse. He looked directly into Daniel's eyes. "Right now, your answers are raising more questions than they are resolving." Daniel inhaled slowly before responding. "Officer, I have cooperated with every request you have made this morning. If there is something specific you are investigating, I would appreciate knowing what it is." Mitchell remained firm. "There was a report of suspicious activity involving an individual matching your description." Daniel did not argue. "I understand the importance of responding to community concerns." Mitchell continued. "At this point, I need you to remain here while I complete my investigation." "I am willing to cooperate," Daniel replied. "I only ask that we keep this respectful." The officer nodded once, but his posture suggested he had already reached a conclusion. Following department procedure as he understood it, he informed Daniel that he was being temporarily detained while the situation was clarified. Daniel neither resisted nor protested. He simply acknowledged the instruction and complied with every direction given. Several neighbors exchanged uncertain glances as they watched the unexpected scene. Mrs. Carter quietly whispered to the man standing beside her, "Daniel has lived here for years. He always waves when he drives by." The man shrugged gently, uncertain what to believe. Appearances, uniforms, and assumptions all carried weight in moments like these. Daniel remained remarkably composed despite becoming the center of attention in the neighborhood he called home. He understood that dignity often revealed itself most clearly when circumstances encouraged embarrassment. After a few quiet moments, he looked toward Officer Mitchell and spoke in the same measured voice he had maintained since the encounter began. "Officer, may I ask for one small courtesy?" Mitchell studied him cautiously. "What is it?" Daniel answered. "I would like permission to send one brief message. It will take less than 10 seconds." The request sounded almost insignificant against the growing tension surrounding them. Mitchell considered it briefly before giving a restrained nod. "One message," he said. "Nothing more." Daniel slowly removed his phone exactly as instructed, typed a short sentence without hesitation, and pressed send. There was no urgency in his expression, no attempt to persuade anyone watching, and no explanation offered afterward. He simply returned the phone, looked calmly down the quiet street, and waited. Officer Mitchell allowed himself a faint smile, convinced the message would change nothing. But somewhere beyond the peaceful neighborhood, unseen by everyone standing on that sidewalk, a single notification had just appeared on a secure government device, and within seconds an entirely different chain of events quietly began moving toward Daniel Brooks' front door. Daniel Brooks never looked at his phone again after sending the brief message. Whatever needed to happen was already in motion, and years of experience had taught him that confidence was often quiet. The neighborhood remained unusually still, suspended somewhere between curiosity and uncertainty. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood only a few feet away, maintaining a watchful posture while occasionally glancing toward his patrol vehicle as though expecting dispatch to confirm the assumptions he already believed were correct. The morning sun climbed higher above the tree line, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawns. Children who had been waiting for school buses whispered to one another, while parents gently encouraged them to keep moving. Even those who left found themselves looking back over their shoulders. Something about the scene felt incomplete, as if everyone sensed they were witnessing only the beginning of a much larger story. Mitchell checked his watch before speaking again. "You seem unusually calm for someone in your situation." Daniel offered a faint smile that revealed neither frustration nor fear. Remaining calm usually helps everyone involved. The officer tilted his head slightly. "Most people become defensive. Most situations are different," Daniel replied. "Every person deserves the opportunity to let facts speak before emotions do." The answer lingered in the morning air. Mitchell did not respond immediately. Instead, he contacted dispatch once more, requesting another verification using additional information from Daniel's identification. The response arrived moments later, but it did not provide the certainty he expected. The records operator explained that portions of the inquiry were unavailable through standard law enforcement databases. Mitchell frowned. To him, unavailable information sounded less like legitimate government work and more like an unanswered question. Daniel understood exactly what those words meant without hearing them. Certain positions simply did not appear through ordinary channels. They never had. Across the street, Mrs. Evelyn Carter finally walked closer, stopping at the edge of her driveway. She did not interrupt the conversation, but concern was visible across her face. She had known Daniel for nearly 6 years. He had helped carry groceries inside after her knee surgery. He had shoveled snow from her walkway during the rare winter storms. He remembered birthdays, greeted every neighbor by name, and never hurried past anyone who wanted a conversation. The man standing quietly on the sidewalk matched everything she knew about him. The growing uncertainty came from the situation itself rather than the person at its center. Mitchell noticed the neighbors watching and straightened his uniform slightly. Public confidence mattered to him. He believed maintaining authority meant demonstrating certainty, especially when others observed his decisions. Daniel noticed the same audience, but viewed them differently. He hoped they would remember not the misunderstanding itself, but the importance of treating people with patience before reaching conclusions. Nearly 4 minutes passed without another word between them. Then, somewhere beyond the entrance to the subdivision, the faint sound of approaching engines drifted through the calm morning air. At first, nobody paid much attention. Delivery trucks and contractors regularly entered the neighborhood after sunrise. The sound gradually grew louder, steadier, more coordinated. Mitchell instinctively turned toward the main road. Daniel remained exactly where he stood. One by one, sleek black sport utility vehicles entered the neighborhood, moving with quiet precision rather than urgency. Their polished exteriors reflected the morning sunlight as they traveled together in disciplined formation. There were no flashing emergency lights, no dramatic sirens, only deliberate purpose. Conversations stopped completely. Every neighbor watching from porches and sidewalks shifted their attention toward the approaching convoy. The vehicles slowed simultaneously before coming to a smooth stop near Daniel's home. Doors opened almost at once. Men and women dressed in dark professional suits stepped out with calm confidence, wearing discreet credentials clipped beneath tailored jackets. Their movements were measured, organized, and unmistakably practiced. No one raised a voice. No one hurried unnecessarily. Yet the atmosphere changed instantly. Mitchell's expression shifted from certainty to visible confusion. He glanced from the arriving officials to Daniel, then back again, trying to understand why multiple federal personnel had appeared on an otherwise quiet residential street. The lead official, a distinguished woman with silver streaks in her neatly tied hair, walked forward with composed authority. She briefly acknowledged Officer Mitchell with a professional nod before directing her attention toward Daniel. Her expression softened into genuine respect. Without hesitation, she stopped a few feet in front of him and spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Good morning, Assistant Special Agent in charge Brooks. We received your message. Is everyone safe?" For the first time that morning, complete silence settled across the neighborhood. Even the birds seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those carefully chosen words. Daniel answered with the same calm voice he had used since leaving his front door. "Yes, everyone is safe." The senior official nodded once before turning toward the officer with quiet professionalism, and in that single moment, the entire understanding of what had happened on the peaceful suburban street began to transform. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood motionless for several seconds, trying to reconcile the quiet man he had questioned with the title he had just heard spoken so naturally. Assistant Special Agent in charge Brooks. The words echoed across the peaceful neighborhood with a weight that no one expected. Every neighbor who had been watching from a respectful distance exchanged uncertain glances, each silently revisiting the assumptions they had formed only moments earlier. The senior federal official maintained her calm professional demeanor before extending her hand toward Daniel Brooks. He accepted it with a polite smile, neither celebrating the moment nor displaying any satisfaction. To him, the greeting was simply another part of a normal workday that had unexpectedly become public. "We apologize for the interruption to your morning," the woman said respectfully. "Your message indicated that immediate supervisory awareness was appropriate." Daniel nodded gently. "Thank you for responding so quickly." She looked toward the surrounding neighborhood before speaking in the same composed tone. "Our priority is ensuring that everyone involved is treated professionally." Officer Mitchell finally found his voice. "Excuse me, ma'am. Could you identify yourself?" Without hesitation, the woman presented her federal credentials for the officer to examine. Mitchell accepted them carefully, reading every line twice before returning them with noticeably different body language. The confidence that had defined his posture throughout the morning was replaced by visible uncertainty. He understood immediately that the credentials were authentic. Another two federal officials quietly approached Daniel, greeting him with the kind of natural familiarity that develops only through years of working together. One handed him a slim folder, while another asked softly, "Is there anything you need before we continue to the briefing?" Daniel shook his head. "No, everyone has remained professional. I appreciate your concern." The response surprised several people standing nearby. There was no anger in his voice, no attempt to embarrass anyone, only calm professionalism. Mrs. Evelyn Carter watched the exchange with growing admiration. She had always believed Daniel was a kind neighbor, but seeing highly trained federal officials treat him with such respect revealed an entirely different dimension of the man who lived across the street. Several more neighbors slowly gathered along the sidewalks, careful not to interfere while quietly witnessing the extraordinary scene unfolding before them. Mitchell cleared his throat before speaking again, choosing his words far more carefully than before. "Assistant Special Agent Brooks, I was not aware of your position." Daniel met his eyes without resentment. "I understand." The simple reply seemed almost more powerful than a lengthy explanation could have been. The senior federal official turned toward the officer with measured professionalism. "Officer Mitchell, Assistant Special Agent Brooks, is assigned to a division whose operational information is intentionally restricted from standard public safety databases. Limited visibility exists for security reasons. That limitation is designed to protect ongoing federal responsibilities, not to create confusion." Mitchell listened carefully before giving a slow nod. "I understand now. We appreciate your willingness to listen," she replied. "Situations involving incomplete information require patience from everyone involved." Daniel quietly picked up his backpack from the sidewalk and adjusted the strap over his shoulder. The movement seemed almost symbolic. Only minutes earlier, the same backpack had been viewed with suspicion. Now it appeared completely ordinary again, simply another professional carrying the tools needed for another day of work. A gentle breeze moved through the neighborhood trees while the atmosphere gradually shifted from tension to reflection. The federal officials remained composed, never crowding the officer or creating unnecessary drama. Their quiet professionalism communicated confidence more effectively than raised voices ever could. One younger federal agent looked toward Daniel with a respectful smile. "The morning briefing has been delayed until your arrival, sir." Daniel nodded appreciatively. "Please thank everyone for their patience." Mitchell heard the exchange and lowered his eyes briefly. Every sentence confirmed what had become unmistakably clear. The man standing before him had never exaggerated his role. He had answered every question honestly while protecting information he was legally obligated to safeguard. Daniel glanced around the neighborhood, noticing familiar faces watching from porches and driveways. Some smiled reassuringly. Others simply looked relieved that the uncertainty had begun giving way to understanding. He hoped the memory they carried from this morning would not be one of embarrassment, but of reflection. The senior federal official spoke once more, this time addressing both Daniel and Officer Mitchell. Moments like these remind all of us that professionalism begins before titles are known. Respect should never depend upon discovering someone's position. Her words settled gently over the quiet street. No one argued with them because no one needed to. They described a truth that everyone present had just experienced firsthand. Daniel offered Officer Mitchell a calm nod that carried neither judgment nor triumph. It was simply the acknowledgement of another public servant doing a difficult job under imperfect circumstances. For the first time that morning, Mitchell returned the gesture with genuine humility. The silence between them no longer felt tense. Instead, it carried the unmistakable feeling that the most important lesson of the day had only just begun. Daniel Brooks looked around the quiet neighborhood one more time before turning his attention back to the senior federal official. The black sport utility vehicles remained parked neatly along the curb, their presence commanding attention without creating disorder. Neighbors who had once watched with uncertainty now observed with thoughtful silence, realizing they had just witnessed how quickly appearances could shape assumptions. Daniel adjusted the strap of his backpack and picked up the stainless steel coffee tumbler he had carefully placed on the hood of his vehicle earlier that morning. The coffee inside was no longer hot, but the simple routine somehow reminded him that ordinary moments often carried extraordinary lessons. The senior official accepted the slim folder from one of the agents before handing it to Daniel. "Your briefing materials have been updated," she said. "Headquarters also asked us to confirm that today's schedule can proceed without modification." Daniel glanced through the first page before closing the folder again. "Please let them know there is no reason to delay the operation. Everyone has responsibilities to fulfill." The surrounding agents nodded with quiet respect. Their confidence in him was obvious, yet none of them displayed unnecessary ceremony. Professionalism was reflected in small gestures rather than dramatic displays. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained beside his patrol vehicle, watching the exchange unfold. The certainty that had guided his decisions earlier had given way to careful reflection. He replayed every question he had asked, every assumption he had made, and every opportunity where patience might have changed the outcome. After a long pause, he stepped forward with measured humility. "Assistant Special Agent Brooks," he began quietly, "I owe you an apology." Daniel looked at him calmly, giving him his full attention. Mitchell continued, "You cooperated from the beginning. You answered my questions respectfully, and you never treated me with hostility even when I questioned your identity. I allowed incomplete information to influence my judgment, and I regret that." The neighborhood remained silent as everyone listened. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he allowed the moment to breathe. He understood that sincere apologies deserved thoughtful responses rather than immediate reactions. Finally, he spoke with the same calm voice that had never changed throughout the morning. "Officer Mitchell, every profession carries difficult decisions. Law enforcement asks people to make those decisions quickly. Federal investigations ask us to do the same. The challenge is remembering that every person standing in front of us has a story we may not know yet." Mitchell listened without interrupting. Daniel continued, "Authority is important. Public safety is important. But respect cannot wait until after someone proves who they are. Respect has to come first." The words settled deeply over the quiet street. Mrs. Evelyn Carter smiled gently from across the sidewalk. Several neighbors lowered their eyes for a moment, reflecting on how easily they had watched events unfold without fully understanding them either. The senior federal official nodded in agreement. "That principle guides every agency at its best," she said. "Professional judgment becomes stronger when it begins with dignity." Mitchell took a slow breath before extending his hand. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn from today instead of making it something else." Daniel accepted the handshake naturally. There was no hesitation, no reluctance, and no sense of victory. It was simply one public servant acknowledging another's willingness to grow. The gesture carried more meaning than any speech could have delivered. A younger federal agent quietly smiled before opening the rear passenger door of one of the waiting vehicles. "We should leave soon, sir. The team is assembled." Daniel nodded. "I will be there in just a moment." Before walking away, he turned once more toward the neighbors who had gathered outside. "Thank you for looking out for one another," he said warmly. "Communities become stronger when people care enough to pay attention. They become even stronger when they leave room for understanding." Heads nodded throughout the neighborhood. The atmosphere that had begun with uncertainty now felt entirely different. It was quieter, wiser, and somehow lighter. Children waiting farther down the block resumed their conversations. The sound of sprinklers returned to the foreground. Birds settled once again into the trees as though the street itself had exhaled. Officer Mitchell watched Daniel walk toward the waiting federal vehicle with the steady confidence that had been there all along. Nothing about Daniel had changed during the past 30 minutes. The only thing that had changed was what everyone else now understood about him. As Daniel reached the open vehicle door, he paused briefly and looked back at the peaceful neighborhood. He hoped the memory people carried from that morning would never be about titles, credentials, or official positions. He hoped they would remember something much simpler. Every stranger deserves the chance to be seen as a human being before being measured by assumptions. With that quiet thought, he stepped into the waiting vehicle, and as the convoy prepared to depart beneath the bright Georgia morning sun, the lesson left behind on that suburban street became far more lasting than the misunderstanding that had first brought everyone together. The convoy moved quietly through the tree-lined streets of suburban Atlanta, blending into the rhythm of morning traffic with remarkable precision. Inside the lead sport utility vehicle, Daniel Brooks sat beside the window holding the briefing folder across his lap, while the familiar neighborhoods gradually gave way to downtown office buildings and federal facilities. Nothing about his expression suggested satisfaction over what had happened outside his home. Instead, he replayed the morning with thoughtful reflection. Years in federal service had taught him that misunderstandings could become opportunities if handled with patience, but they could also become lasting divisions if answered with pride. Across from him, the senior federal official closed a secure tablet before looking toward Daniel. "Headquarters has already received a preliminary report regarding the incident," she said. The director's office asked only one question. Daniel looked up with quiet curiosity. "What was the question?" She smiled faintly. "They wanted to know whether you wished to file a formal complaint immediately." Daniel looked through the windshield for several seconds before answering. "Not immediately." One of the younger agents sitting nearby seemed surprised. "Most people would." Daniel nodded gently. "Most people have every right to make that choice. But before any decision is made, I want the complete picture. I want facts, not emotions." The vehicle continued through the city beneath the bright Georgia sky while the conversation settled into thoughtful silence. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, Officer Ryan Mitchell remained beside his patrol vehicle long after the federal convoy disappeared from view. Dispatch finally contacted him again through the radio, asking whether the situation had been resolved. Mitchell answered professionally. "The situation has concluded peacefully. I will be submitting a detailed incident report." His voice sounded noticeably different than it had earlier that morning. There was less certainty, but far more reflection. After ending the transmission, he stood quietly for another moment before opening the notebook he carried throughout every shift. Instead of recording only times and procedures, he wrote something personal in the margin beside the official report. He wrote 4 simple words. "Verify before you conclude." He stared at the sentence for several seconds before carefully closing the notebook. Across the street, Mrs. Evelyn Carter slowly walked over carrying 2 bottles of water from her kitchen. "Officer," she said kindly, offering 1 bottle. Mitchell accepted it with genuine appreciation. Thank you. She smiled warmly. Today was difficult for everyone. He nodded. It was. After a brief pause, she added, Daniel has always been a good neighbor. I suppose we all learned something this morning. Mitchell looked toward Daniel's now quiet driveway. I certainly did. There was no defensiveness in his response. Only honesty. Several other neighbors gradually returned to their normal routines. Children boarded school buses. Delivery drivers continued making stops. Lawn care crews arrived exactly on schedule. Within half an hour, the street looked almost exactly as it had before sunrise. Yet everyone who had witnessed the morning carried away a slightly different understanding of how quickly assumptions could influence perception. At federal headquarters, Daniel entered a secure conference room where members of his investigative team were already assembled around a large table displaying maps, briefing documents, and digital presentations. Conversations paused the moment he entered. One senior analyst smiled. Good morning, sir. We heard your commute became more eventful than expected. Soft laughter moved around the room, not because anyone found the misunderstanding amusing, but because they recognized Daniel's remarkable ability to remain composed under unexpected circumstances. Daniel placed his folder on the table before answering. The commute reminded me of something important. Everyone looked toward him. Never allow your title to determine the amount of respect you offer another person. If respect only appears after credentials appear, then it was never respect to begin with. The room grew quiet. Experienced investigators understood that lesson carried weight far beyond the morning's events. The senior federal official who had accompanied Daniel into headquarters leaned against the conference table before speaking. Leadership requested an update regarding today's incident. They also wanted me to tell everyone something. She paused briefly before continuing. Assistant Special Agent Brooks specifically requested that our focus remain on today's mission instead of yesterday's misunderstanding. Several team members exchanged respectful glances. One investigator quietly observed, "That sounds exactly like him." Daniel smiled modestly. Every hour spent dwelling on assumptions is an hour taken away from serving the public. Those words remained with the team as the briefing officially began. Outside the conference room, another ordinary workday unfolded across the federal building. Phones rang, elevators opened and closed, analysts reviewed intelligence, and agents prepared for assignments across the country. Life moved forward as it always did. Yet somewhere across Atlanta, one neighborhood police officer, several thoughtful neighbors, and an entire federal team now shared the same quiet reminder. The strongest authority is never demonstrated by the power to command others. It is revealed by the wisdom to treat every person with dignity before knowing who they are. The federal briefing concluded shortly before noon, but the conversation that remained with Daniel Brooks had very little to do with the investigation displayed across the conference room screens. As the other agents gathered their notes and prepared for assignments throughout the Southeast, several younger investigators lingered behind, hoping to ask a question that had quietly stayed on their minds ever since they heard what had happened that morning. One of them finally spoke. "Sir, may I ask you something personal?" Daniel smiled warmly. "Of course." The young agent hesitated for only a moment. "When everything was happening outside your house, were you ever tempted to tell the officer exactly who you were right away?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "The thought crossed my mind, but the answer would not have changed the principle I was trying to protect." The room grew quiet again. Daniel continued in the calm, measured voice that had become familiar to everyone who worked with him. "If respect depends on discovering someone's title, then respect was never present in the first place. Every citizen deserves professional treatment before anyone knows what occupation they have, how much money they earn, or what authority they carry." Several agents nodded thoughtfully while taking mental notes that no training manual could fully teach. The senior federal official who had accompanied Daniel earlier smiled with quiet admiration. "That philosophy is one reason you lead this division," she said. Daniel accepted the compliment with humility before gathering his own materials. Leadership is not about standing above people. It is about remembering that every decision affects someone's family. Those words followed the team as they left the conference room and returned to their daily responsibilities. Across town, Officer Ryan Mitchell had also returned to his station. The familiar sounds of ringing telephones, computer keyboards, and radio traffic filled the building, yet everything felt slightly different to him now. He sat at his desk reviewing the incident report one final time before submitting it through the department's reporting system. He read each sentence carefully, making certain that every observation reflected exactly what had occurred instead of what he had initially assumed. Accuracy suddenly felt more important than speed. After submitting the report, he requested a brief meeting with his supervising lieutenant. The older officer welcomed him into the office with an encouraging smile. "Everything resolved this morning?" Mitchell nodded. "Yes, sir." Peacefully. The lieutenant noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. "But something is still bothering you." Mitchell answered honestly. "I learned today that confidence without patience can become a dangerous combination. I want to make certain I do better the next time I meet someone whose story I do not know." The lieutenant remained silent for a few moments before replying. Recognizing that lesson early in your career may become one of the most valuable experiences you ever have. Mitchell appreciated those words more than he expected. They did not erase the morning, but they reminded him that growth often begins with honest reflection. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned home after completing his federal responsibilities. The neighborhood looked exactly as peaceful as it always had. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Neighbors trimmed hedges and collected mail. Mrs. Evelyn Carter waved from her porch the moment she saw Daniel pull into his driveway. "Welcome home," she called with a cheerful smile. Daniel waved back. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I hope the rest of your day has been much quieter than the beginning." She laughed softly. "It certainly has." After parking his vehicle, Daniel stepped out carrying the same backpack that had become the unexpected focus of so much attention earlier that morning. It looked no different now than it had before sunrise. Neither did he. The only real difference existed in what people had learned while watching an ordinary morning become extraordinary. As Daniel walked toward his front door, he noticed another familiar vehicle slowly approaching along the street. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped out, this time without urgency and without uncertainty. He removed his hat before walking respectfully toward the front walkway. Daniel met him halfway with the same calm expression he had shown throughout the day. Mitchell spoke first. "I wanted to thank you one more time. Not because you accepted my apology, but because you gave me something to think about that I will carry for the rest of my career." Daniel smiled gently. "Then today accomplished something worthwhile." Mitchell nodded. "I believe it did." The two men stood together for a moment beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, no longer separated by assumptions or misunderstanding, but connected by a shared commitment to serving others with greater wisdom than they had possessed only hours earlier. Sometimes the most meaningful victories are not measured by who was right or who held more authority. They are measured by whether two people walk away better than they were when they first met. The following week brought the neighborhood back to its familiar rhythm. Yet the memory of that quiet morning continued to ripple far beyond the tree-lined streets where it had begun. Daniel Brooks rarely thought about recognition. His career had been built upon the opposite principle. The most effective work often happened without headlines, applause, or public attention. Still, he understood that meaningful change sometimes started with a single conversation, and sometimes that conversation began in the least expected place. On Tuesday evening, the local community association gathered inside a modest recreation center only a few miles from Daniel's neighborhood. Residents attended to discuss traffic concerns, neighborhood safety, volunteer events, and plans for the annual fall festival. Officer Ryan Mitchell arrived in full uniform, not because he was required to speak, but because he had asked to attend. He wanted to meet the people he served outside the pressure of emergency calls and uncertain situations. Daniel accepted an invitation from several neighbors to attend as well, choosing a seat near the middle of the room instead of the front. He preferred listening before speaking. As the meeting progressed, conversations moved naturally from routine neighborhood topics to broader discussions about trust between communities and public servants. One resident quietly raised a thoughtful question. "How do we make sure people feel respected before misunderstandings happen?" The room became silent. Before anyone else responded, Officer Mitchell slowly stood. His voice was steady but noticeably more reflective than it had been only a week earlier. "I cannot answer for every officer," he began. "I can only answer for myself. I learned recently that professionalism begins long before certainty. Sometimes we believe we have enough information when we actually have only part of the picture. The responsibility to slow down, listen carefully, and treat every person with dignity belongs to all of us." Several people nodded thoughtfully. There was no defensiveness in his words and no attempt to excuse the past. Instead, there was sincere accountability supported by a genuine desire to improve. After a brief pause, Mitchell turned toward Daniel, who remained quietly seated among his neighbors. "I also learned something else," he continued. "The strongest people are often the calmest people. I was given patience when I had not yet earned it, and I hope to extend that same patience to others from this day forward." The room remained silent for a heartbeat before gentle applause gradually filled the community center. Daniel smiled modestly, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. When the applause faded, one of the organizers invited him to share a few words if he wished. Daniel stood slowly and looked around the room at familiar faces, young families, retired couples, local business owners, teachers, firefighters, and police officers sitting side by side. "Communities are built through ordinary moments," he said calmly. "Most of us will never remember every meeting we attend or every conversation we have, but people always remember how they were treated. Titles eventually change. Careers eventually end. Uniforms are eventually folded away. Character is the only thing that follows us everywhere we go." His words settled gently across the room. He continued, "Respect is not something we should reserve for impressive introductions. It belongs to every person we meet. If we wait until someone proves they deserve kindness, then kindness becomes a reward instead of a principle." The audience listened in thoughtful silence before another round of warm applause filled the room. No one celebrated one individual over another. Instead, they recognized a lesson that belonged equally to everyone present. After the meeting concluded, neighbors gathered in small conversations throughout the recreation center. Children laughed while enjoying cookies near the refreshment table. Volunteers discussed future service projects. Officer Mitchell and Daniel stood together near the entrance, speaking naturally, no longer connected by a misunderstanding, but by a shared commitment to strengthening the community they both served in different ways. Mrs. Evelyn Carter walked over carrying 2 paper cups of fresh coffee and handed one to each man with a cheerful smile. "I think this neighborhood is going to be just fine," she said warmly. Daniel smiled. "I believe so too." Mitchell nodded in agreement. Outside, the evening sun cast a golden glow across the quiet parking lot as families returned home together. The meeting ended without headlines, cameras, or dramatic announcements. Yet something meaningful had quietly taken root. Trust had not been restored through authority alone. It had grown through humility, honest conversation, and the willingness to learn from an uncomfortable moment. Those qualities would remain long after everyone forgot the exact date the meeting had taken place. Several months passed, and the memory of that quiet morning slowly became less about a single misunderstanding and more about the lasting choices that followed it. Autumn arrived across Georgia, painting neighborhood streets with shades of gold and crimson while families gathered outdoors to enjoy cooler evenings. Daniel Brooks continued serving his country with the same quiet dedication that had always defined his career. Most mornings began exactly as they had before, with a cup of coffee, a simple backpack, and a peaceful walk from his front door to his vehicle. The difference was not in Daniel himself. It was in the people around him. Neighbors greeted one another a little more intentionally. Conversations lasted a little longer. New families moving into the neighborhood found themselves welcomed with genuine warmth rather than cautious distance. The lesson that had begun on one driveway had quietly spread through an entire community. Officer Ryan Mitchell also continued serving with renewed purpose. His supervisors noticed subtle but meaningful changes in the way he approached every call. He listened longer before reaching conclusions. He asked clearer questions before making assumptions. Younger officers who partnered with him often heard him repeat the same simple reminder during patrol. Take one more moment. Sometimes that extra moment changes everything. He never shared the story to gain sympathy or praise. He shared it because experience had become one of his greatest teachers. One crisp Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood gathered once again for the annual fall festival. Children laughed while running between pumpkin displays and food trucks. Local musicians played familiar American songs beneath colorful decorations. Volunteers served hot apple cider while firefighters, police officers, teachers, and community organizations welcomed residents with friendly conversations. Daniel arrived wearing a casual navy jacket and jeans, blending naturally into the crowd like any other neighbor enjoying the weekend. Officer Mitchell greeted families at the community safety booth only a short distance away. Their eyes met across the park, and both men smiled before walking toward each other. This time there was no tension, no uncertainty, and no audience waiting to see what would happen next. There were simply two public servants greeting one another as neighbors. "Good afternoon," Mitchell said warmly. "Good afternoon," Daniel replied. They shook hands naturally before spending several minutes talking about ordinary life rather than extraordinary events. They discussed community projects, neighborhood improvements, and the upcoming holiday season. Children ran past them carrying balloons while parents laughed nearby. The conversation felt refreshingly normal, exactly the way both men preferred it. Mrs. Evelyn Carter eventually joined them carrying 3 cups of hot cider. She handed one to each of them before smiling with quiet satisfaction. "This is how I always hoped I would see the two of you talking," she said. Daniel looked around the festival, watching families from every background share food, music, and conversation without hesitation. "Communities become stronger one relationship at a time," he replied. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "And trust grows through everyday choices." As the afternoon sun began lowering across the park, the festival organizer invited several local leaders onto a small stage to thank the volunteers who had helped strengthen the neighborhood throughout the year. Daniel politely declined the invitation to stand in the spotlight, encouraging the organizer to recognize the teachers, emergency responders, and volunteers instead. Mitchell made the same request. Neither man believed the story belonged to them alone. It belonged to everyone willing to choose understanding over assumption. The applause that followed celebrated an entire community rather than a single individual. As evening settled across the park, strings of warm lights illuminated the trees while families slowly made their way home. Daniel stood for a quiet moment watching children laugh together without noticing differences that adults sometimes allowed to become barriers. He smiled gently, believing that perhaps the greatest measure of progress was found in moments exactly like this. Officer Mitchell looked across the festival grounds with the same quiet reflection. He realized that authority could open conversations, but only character could earn trust. Before leaving, the two men exchanged one final handshake beneath the glowing autumn lights. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. There did not need to be. The greatest victories are often the quiet ones that change hearts instead of headlines. As Daniel walked toward his vehicle beneath the clear Georgia sky, one lasting truth remained stronger than every title, every badge, and every assumption. He thought he understood the person standing before him. But that day, the truth reminded everyone that real justice begins the moment we choose to see the human being before the uniform, before the profession, and before the story is fully known.